Hello, everyone, and welcome back. In the last session, we have looked at Kubernetes control plane. So, basically, control plane is where your API server, the etcd, and all those components would be running. We also discussed a bit about your data plane, the worker nodes, and everything. Now, in today's session, we will be looking at how you can create your cluster on EKS. Once again, before I start off with the session, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So let's get started with this. So here I have my AWS console and I'm in Mumbai region. So you can choose the region that you want to create your EKS cluster. And then we will navigate to the EKS service. So you can search for EKS and this is the service that we have. So we'll go to the service, and the first thing that we will need to do is we will need to create our control plane, which is going to be part of our cluster. So you have the option of either creating a new cluster or you can register an existing cluster that you have. We're not going to look at the register at this point. So we will go ahead and we'll click on this create cluster and we start filling in the details. So we don't want the auto mode. We will go with the custom configuration so that we can fill in the details. So I don't want to use the EKS auto mode. You can give a name to this. So what name do you want to give to your cluster? So let's call this as web app demo. You can give whatever name that you want. Then you will need to specify your role. So your cluster will be creating resources on your behalf, like your EC2 instances. It will be interacting with your VPC service and different services. So it needs to have the necessary permissions at your cluster level. So for this, you can just click on this create recommended role, which will take you to the IAM service. So this is for your cluster. And next, this will be your permissions. All right. So you have everything pre-filled. So we just go with next. We'll give a name to this. So this is going to be our EKS cluster role. So you can see here, allow the cluster Kubernetes control plane to manage your AWS resources on your behalf. So the control plane needs access to work with other AWS services. And then click on create role, and this will create the IAM role for us. So we will go back to the other tab and we'll just refresh this page and we should be able to see the new role that we have created. Next, you can specify which version of Kubernetes you want to run. At this point, I'm going with 1.30 because in the next session, I will be showing you how you can upgrade your cluster as well. So I'm going at a lower version at this point, but I mean, you can choose the latest we have is 1.32 and by default, it selects 1.31. And then your upgrade policy. So this option basically it supports the Kubernetes version for 14 months after the release date. But if you want extended version, you can go with this, but you have to pay money for this. So we'll go with the standard one. Cluster access. So do you want to allow admin access to the API and also your config map? Like you want to use IAM principles to basically store your access related information in the config map. At this point, we're not looking at this. We will just go with the EKS API and then your secret. So we are just going with the default at this point. And then click on next, and then you select your VPC. So at this point, we are going with the default VPC, the default subnets that we have. And if you want to attach any additional security groups, you can do that as well. Let me attach this. Okay, I'm not going to attach a security group, but there's one particular change that we will need to do in the security group for this to work. So I'll be talking about that later on. And we are using IPv4. And then your cluster endpoint access. So do you want to allow public or public and private or just private? So we are going with public and private so that we can access the cluster API endpoint from the internet as well as within your resources from your VPC, even that as well. And then next, this is your observability, basically pushing your logs and everything to your CloudWatch. We're not dealing with this right now. We will be having a separate session for this later on. And then next, and this is your add-ons. So your kubeproxy, your VPC CNI. So basically what all add-ons you want. So you have some default add-ons that are included here. So you have the core DNS, which enables your service discovery. Then your kubeproxy, which is your networking. Then node monitoring agent, which is to monitor the health of your nodes. The VPC CNI, which is your networking for your cluster. and then your pod identity agent, which is to basically grant IAM permissions to your pods, basically using the service accounts. So these are some of the default ones. If you want more, you can add them as well. Like, you want to use EBS, then you can add this driver. Then you want to use EFS and your SageMaker. So based on your use case, CloudWatch, S3, and everything. And then we have this metrics as well. At this point, we don't want the metrics. There are also your marketplace add-ons that you want. If you want, you can add, like, you have Sync, you have Apache Kafka, and that you can choose from. But we are just going with the default ones that we have over here. So we are going with 5: CoreDNS, kubeproxy, node monitoring agent, Amazon VPC CNI, and the Amazon EKS pod identity agent. Then we'll go to the next page, and this is where you can specify the version. So this is the default version we have. So we will leave it to the default versions that we have here. This is for all the add-ons that we have included in the previous page. Next, we get to review everything. So you can review your cluster information, your tags, your networking, observability, add-ons, version. So you can review everything. And once you're okay with this, just click on create, and this will start creating a cluster. Now, a very important point to remember here is the user that you have used to create this cluster. By default, only that user will have access to the API. So now I will talk more about that in some time, but at this point I have created this cluster using my root account. So basically the root user. So the root user will have access to this cluster, so I can interact with the cluster using the kubectl and everything. But if you're using any other user, like an IAM user or an IAM role, then you will not be able to access the cluster. You will get permission issues. So I will show that to you in some time. Let's wait for this cluster to come up. So this will take a few minutes. So I'm gonna pause here and I'll wait for this cluster to come up. Okay, so finally we have the cluster up and running. So you can see the cluster is active. So it took about close to 8 minutes for the cluster to be active. So now that our cluster is active, now this is just the control plane. We still need the data plane, the worker nodes, to be part of this cluster. So that would be our next step. So to add your worker nodes to the cluster, you can go to the compute over here, and we will start adding a node group to this. So click on add node group and start giving a name to this. So let's call this as web app nodes. And again, this will also need an IAM role to basically, interact with other services and, do various things. So again, just click on this create recommended role, where AWS would basically fill in everything for us. So this is for EC2, and the permissions. Let me go to the next page and I'll show you here. Yeah, so this is the permissions that it would get. So EC2 contains, so it gets permission to the ECR in case it needs to pull images from there, the worker node policy and the CNI policy. So we'll give a name to this. So let's call this as EKS node role, and then we will create this role. So again, we'll go back to the other tab and we'll refresh this page, and we'll just select the role that we've just created. We're not using a template. All these things, we're not looking at this right now. So we're not adding any labels, any taintings. Next, we fill in the details for your instance. So which AMI you want to use, the operating system. The capacity is going to be on demand, the instance type. So we are going with T3.medium, which gives me 2 CPU core, 4 GB RAM. So please be careful, you will be charged for this. So if you're creating this cluster, you'll be charged. So please keep that in mind. And then depending on the capacity, the size of storage that you want. This is for your scaling. So I'm going to leave it to the default, which is I want 2 instances, minimum is 2, maximum is 2. But generally in production, you will increase the maximum size to maybe 5 or 10 based on your use case. And then you have the maximum unavailable. So I'm telling, so in case there's a outage or you're doing a rolling update or something, so I'm telling that I want to make sure there's one node always running, right? So you can increase this. You can also give a percentage. That's up to you. Next, you specify your subnets. So the VPC, basically in which subnets you want to run your instances. Next, you get to review everything. And once this is done, click on create. And this will start launching the EC2 instances for us. All right. So again, this will take some time. So we will have to wait for this. But essentially what will happen now is your instances will be launched over here. So this will take some time. So let's wait for this to complete. Again, I'm going to pause here and I'll wait for these instances to be available. Okay, so now you can see here the node status, it says active. So it took about 5 minutes for the instances to be launched. So if I refresh this again, I should be able to see my two EC2 instances, which are going to be part of my cluster. So this is one instance and this is the other instance. Now, if I go back to my cluster, I should be, if I go to the compute section, I should be able to see my instances as well. So now we have created our cluster. All right. So we have our control plane ready, and we also have our data plane, the worker nodes ready as well. So you can see the details over here. This is managed, the group and everything. You can also create, Fargate the serverless compute if you want. That's totally up to you. We have discussed about the different types that we have in the last session. So we have the managed node groups, we have the self-managed nodes, and then we have the Fargate. Now, the next step is how do we interact with this cluster? How do we connect to this cluster? Now, for this, what I've done is I already launched an EC2 instance, but just so you're clear and you can follow the steps, I'm going to launch a new instance and show you once again how you can interact with this cluster. So let me terminate this instance and I'll launch a fresh one, and then we can take it from there. So let me launch a new instance over here. So this is going to be my EKS demo. We'll go with the Amazon Linux, and t2.micro should be enough for this. I'll select my key pair, my firewall, and then we will launch this instance. Now, let me just wait for that instance to come up. But there are a couple of prerequisites that you will need for connecting to the cluster. One is you will need to install AWS CLI, and the other is you will need to install kubectl. So if you want to run, like you want to get the list of nodes, you need to have kubectl. So I'll be providing the link to this, though I've covered this in the previous sessions. I'll provide this again in the description section, but yeah, you will need the AWS CLI as well as a kubectl for this to work. So let's go back and see if my instance is running. So here is my instance. This is running. So let me do an SSH into this. Okay, so here is my EC2 instance, and this is what we will be using to interact with our cluster. So like I said, first, let's quickly update our machine. Sudo yum update. And then we will need to install the CLI tool. So for that, we can use sudo yum install AWS CLI. So this, okay, so it looks like I already have it. So that's good. So I have my AWS installed. Now we will also need the kubectl. So let me just run these instructions here. So this will download the binaries for us. And then we will install the binaries. And then we can validate our version, and this should give me the version. So we have our kubectl ready as well. So these are the two prerequisites. Now, how do you interact with the cluster, right? So for that, we can use this AWS command, which would be AWS EKS update -cube config, and then the name of your cluster. So in our case, the name of the cluster is web app demo. Sorry, I need to give a space. And then the region. So in which region your cluster is running. So in our case, it is running in Mumbai, which would be AP South 1. So let me provide that. Now, at this point, this will not work. You will need to have the necessary permission. So since I'm running an EC2 instance, I will simply attach a IAM role to this. So let's go back here. And I already have a role that I've created. And this basically has administrator access. So you can go ahead and do that as well. You don't have to worry about this. We don't need that. We just need the administrator access for this to work. So please create a role for your EC2 and we will attach this to our EC2 instance. So let's go back to the EC2 instance. We'll go to actions, security, and modify the role, and we will select the role over here. So we will update this, and this should give the permission but only partially. So let me run this again, and so this should add the config file of our cluster on this EC2 instance, and now we should be able to interact with our cluster. So let's try to get the list of nodes that we have. So we'll try this kubectl get nodes command, and this will not work. All right, so there are two more things that we will need to do for this to work. One is we will need to update our security groups that is attached to this cluster. So let's go back to the cluster and we will go to the networking, and here is the security group that we have. So let's open up this security group and we will need to allow 443. So you can see here that we are getting a timeout on 443. So let's go to this, we will edit this, and I'll add a new rule for HTTPS. And I mean, since this is my personal account, I'm giving 0.0.0, but generally at an organization level, this will be like your VPN or your internal network IP range. So I'll save this rule. So that should resolve the timeout error, right? So let me run this command once again. And now the other error that you will see is this error. So, the server has asked for the client to provide credentials. So this is the one that I was talking in the beginning, where you will need to create the cluster as a user with which you will be accessing the cluster. So in this case, if I go back to the cluster and if I go to this access, uh, so these are the IAM access, the users or the roles that currently have access to the cluster from the CLS. So you can see this cluster was created using the root user. So the root user should be able to run this command. But in this case, we are using an EC2 instance, and that instance has an IAM role which is trying to access the cluster. So that's where we are getting the error. So two options that you have. So one is to begin with, you create your cluster using a non-root user, all right, and then use that non-root user to interact with your cluster, or any role or user that you're using to interact, you will need to add that over here, and you will need to attach the necessary permissions. So in our case, we are using this particular role. So we will need to give explicit permissions to this. So I'll get the ARN of this. I'll go back here and we will create an access entry. So this is for our role, right? And then type is going to be standard. So we will leave it to the default. And next is your permission. So in our case, we want to give access to the cluster. So Amazon EKS cluster admin policy, and we are giving it at the cluster level. You can also give it at the namespace, but in this case, we are giving it at the cluster level. Next, you get to review everything and then click on create. And this will give you the role that we have attached to the EC2 instance, the necessary permissions to okay, so for some reason here you can see the access policy is not updated. So let me try adding this once again. I'm not sure why that did not come. So let me add this once again. And yeah, so now I can see. And if I go back, yeah, so now I'm able to see the permission. So this is the role that we have attached to our instance. So if I try this AWS STS get caller identity, I should be able to see the role that is currently attached, right? So we are giving this role the permission to interact with our cluster. So now if I try this command once again, I should be able to see my nodes. So these are my data plane, the worker nodes that we are basically able to see. So that's basically how you can interact with your cluster. So let's say if you have any pods, obviously we don't have any pods at this point. So basically now I'm interacting with the cluster. So that's how you can create your cluster on EKS, and then you can interact with your cluster as well. There are a few things that you will need to keep in mind. So once again, one, you need the AWS CLI tool. You need the kubectl tool, and then you will need to allow 443 in your security groups, and then you will need to update this IAM access entries to basically allow the user or the role with which you are trying to access the cluster. So in our case, you're using the IAM role, so that's why I've explicitly included the role, and then I've given the permission as well, and now we are able to interact with our cluster. So that's all I have for this session. At any point, if you feel like you want to destroy this cluster, then step one would be to delete the node groups and then delete your cluster. Even if you try deleting the cluster, it won't allow you to delete. It will tell you to delete the node groups first. So yeah, I mean, go ahead and give it a try, but please keep in mind you'll be charged for this, and there are a few important steps that you will need to keep in mind. That's all I have for this session. If you found this session helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel for more content and share the video with your circle. If you have any feedback or any queries, please leave them in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.